Hi everyone, welcome back to this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. My name is Aaron Wendland. I'm Vision Fellow in Public Philosophy at King's College London and a Senior Research Fellow at Massey College Toronto. And I'm honored to be hosting this benefit event. The title of the conference is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis. And it's meant to generate support for establishing a Center for Civic Engagement at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. This center, in turn, will provide support for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine who are doing wonderful work in very difficult circumstances. After the talk, we'll put some information up on the screen that will enable you to contribute to this cause, and we encourage you to give generously. With that said, it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Timothy Snyder. Timothy is Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University. He is the author of Nationalism, Marxism, and Modern Central Europe, The Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, and The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, and America. Snyder's work has been translated into 40 languages. He has received state orders from Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland, and he is the winner of the Hannah Arendt Prize for Political Thought. With that said, the title of Timothy's talk is Thinking About Freedom in Wartime Ukraine. Timothy, thanks for participating, and over to you.
Greetings. I'm very happy to be able to speak to you in this conference with these colleagues. The subject that I have chosen for myself is thinking about freedom in wartime Ukraine. The basis for all this, the basis for this title is a conference that I ran together with some friends and colleagues in 2014, just as the Russian invasion of Ukraine began, the first Russian invasion of spring of 2014. I brought people from North America and Europe to Kyiv and ran a conference called Thinking Together. And although that's a very simple idea, I like to think that it's a useful one, that when I speak about philosophy in Ukraine, what I'm going to be doing is not instructing as to how philosophy might be applied to Ukraine. I will instead be thinking together with Ukrainians and with others about what I take to be the central subject of this conflict, which is freedom. So I'm glad to be here together with Margaret Atwood, with my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, Volodymyr Yarmolenko, Mikhailo Vinitsky. Very glad to be here together with philosophers. I understand that the general framework within which we're supposed to discuss is what good is philosophy. I'm going to be aiming for something slightly different, which is how might we think better, or how might philosophy be better if we think together during this war. My subject is freedom, and my method is going to be very simple. I'm going to begin from what the philosophers or other colleagues might call a speech act. I'm going to begin from an utterance of two words, and I'm going to think together with the person who uttered those two words. My subject is going to be freedom, and I'm going to break it down into four parts: freedom and speech, freedom and risk, freedom and obligation, and freedom and security. So the two words are President tut, which means the president is here. Those two words were uttered by the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, on the 25th of February 2022, just as the invasion had begun, 3 days into the invasion. I want to use those two words to talk about freedom first, freedom and speech. I want to treat that act of President Zelensky of coming out of his offices, going onto the street, filming a selfie at the beginning of this invasion as a kind of paradigmatic act of free speech. Now, that might not be the first association that people have. And if it's not, I'm going to suggest that that might be because of our bad habits. that we tend to treat, both in politics, maybe also in philosophy, colleagues can correct me, but certainly in politics and in everyday social discourse, we treat freedom of speech as an empty concept. We don't pay attention to the substance of what's said, the setting where something is said, the semantics, how something is said. None of those things matter. All that matters in our everyday portrayal of freedom of speech is the lack of restriction. What I want to suggest, I'm going to make this argument around those two words. What I'm going to suggest is that this has it backwards. That the reason why we care about the lack of restriction is because of the substance, because of the setting, and because of the semantics. That the substance, the setting, and the semantics matter very much. And the reason they matter very much, or the way in which they matter very much, because I want to say they matter in a very particular way. The way that they matter is the purpose of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech isn't an empty concept. It's not a reflexive concept. It's not a kind of habit. Freedom of speech has a purpose. The purpose of freedom of speech is to allow people to speak truth to power. Now, that's not an original observation of mine. There's a tradition of this which goes back to Euripides, as reinterpreted much more recently by Foucault. So I want to suggest that when President Zelensky said on 25 February 2022 that he was there, President Tut, that he was there, I am here, the president is here, he was, of course, speaking the truth. That may seem banal, but he was speaking the truth. He was saying something which was true. In fact, he was in Kyiv at that moment. He was where he said he was. He was doing what he said he was doing. He was speaking truth against a background of lies. So one of the reasons why he was there saying what he was saying is that at that moment, 3 days into the war, at a time when a lot of people thought the war was about to end, the Russians were claiming that he'd already left Kyiv, right? So he was speaking truth against a background of lies. He was also speaking truth to power. Teams of assassins were nearby, probably in Kyiv itself. Tanks seemed to be on the way into the city. They'd gotten very close at that point. Bombs and missiles were falling. So he was speaking truth to power. And this is an interesting third part of freedom of speech. The truth that he was speaking was true because he made it true. So it was true because of what he was doing with his body. What he was saying was risky. It was risky to say what he was saying, not just because it was true, but it described a risky state of affairs, but also because in the very act of speaking, he was taking a physical risk, a corporeal risk. And here we take a slight lateral move from one tradition into another. There's another tradition of freedom of speech, I think a closely related one, associated with the Czech philosopher Jan Patočka and with the Czech political thinker and dissident Václav Havel, which says that a truth is something that you avouch. So it may describe the external world, but it's true. It becomes true the moment that you avouch it, where the moment in which you invest in it, the moment in which you associate it with your own bodily existence. Now, this notion of freedom of speech, I think, is the correct one. Freedom of speech has a purpose. The purpose is to allow people to speak truth to power. And given that purpose, freedom of speech will involve, as Havel and Patočka suggest, it will involve a certain amount of risk. I think we can see the flesh of this concept. I think we can see the power of this notion of freedom of speech when we come back and contrast it to our everyday way of talking about freedom of speech. If we contrast that speech act of Volodymyr Zelensky to the kinds of things that we usually put into our little category of freedom of speech, we notice some important differences. We tend to be worried about situations where very powerful people are speaking untruths in order to maintain power. Against this background, that doesn't seem to be so important. We often fret about free speech on campus, by which we mean something like people coming to campus to say the most annoying thing that they can and then fleeing in their limousines. That doesn't really seem so central. That doesn't seem to be really a central case of what freedom of speech is about. It might be that de facto those sorts of things would have to be protected by any reasonable law. But those kinds of actions, I think, speaking untruth to maintain power, or deliberately abusing the notion of free speech in the name of free speech, those kinds of things, I think, have to be treated with suspicion rather than valorized. No one is showing valor when they provoke needless, mindless controversy in an entirely safe situation. No one is showing valor when, already holding power, they lie to try to preserve or magnify that power. The thing which should be valorized, or the person who should be valorized, is the person who is taking risks to speak truth to power. So, and the notion of the person here, I think, is also very important. I've been trying to say freedom of speech rather than free speech, and that is for a reason. And I may have failed. I may have fallen into the cliche of saying free speech. But the reason is that free speech, I think, is a cliche which leads us in the wrong direction, because it suggests that the thing which is free is speech, as opposed to the person. And it may seem like I'm splitting hairs, but I'm not. A huge number of utterances with which we're confronted every day, or a huge percentage of the utterances with which we're confronted every day, are produced by algorithms, magnified or even produced by algorithms. That is, they're produced by entities that are not human, right, and do not have rights. And so I think it's pretty important that one of the ways in which we organize our conversation around the freedom of speech is to make sure that the utterance is actually connected to a person. Because if it's not connected to a person, if it's just some digital agglomeration, then it doesn't have any rights. There's no person connected to it. There is no truth, because the algorithm doesn't care about truth. It can't be spoken to power, because the algorithm has no attitude to power, right? Or put it more simply, there just isn't a speaker, right? So freedom of speech is the right term because it implies the freedom of the speaker. And that seems to be the crucial concept. And the speaker, in this case and others, is displaying freedom, embodying freedom by taking a risk. Which leads me to the second category of freedom, or the second association with freedom about which I wanted to speak, which is freedom and risk. So we're done for now with freedom and speech. Now I'd like to talk about freedom and risk. And as I do this, I just want to recall my method. I'm staying with those two words spoken on the 25th of February of last year by President Zelensky, those two words, President tut, the president is here. And as I move forward, I will also be slowly moving into my own engagement with him about those words when we've talked about them. So the second point, freedom and risk. In order to think about this, I want to step back from those two words and the setting in which Volodymyr Zelensky spoke them and move into a more American setting, as I recalled and experienced it of those days in February 2022. So in that week, in those days before the war, I felt pretty isolated in my claim, my publicly recorded claim, that Zelensky would remain in Kyiv. That was my view. It was certainly a minority view. I felt strange saying it the way you feel strange when everyone else is saying the opposite of what you're saying. But I said it I said it so that it was broadcast on an important Sunday evening American television show, 60 Minutes. So it was broadcast on 60 Minutes on Sunday, the 20th of February, my idea that Zelensky would remain. So again, this is before he did remain and before he said those two words. This is 5 days before that. It's the Sunday. On Monday, the 21st, the next day, I was sitting right where I'm sitting now in order to take part remotely in the doctoral defense of a history doctoral student defending a dissertation in Lviv in Western Ukraine at the Ukrainian Catholic University. The student passed, and then immediately joined the Ukrainian Territorial Defense. On the 22nd of February, on the Tuesday, I took part as a guest in a class of a Yale colleague where the colleague had convened security advisors from both the Trump and the Obama administrations. And among other things, he asked them the same question that I had been asked: will Zelensky stay if there is a Russian invasion of Ukraine? And to my recollection, all of them said that Zelensky would flee. They were very polite in their disagreement with me, but they said Zelensky is going to flee. So this is the setting that I want to recall. And I guess I want to be asking why it was that we all thought that, and what does it say about us that we thought that? There's a simple answer to this, which is that the Americans had just experienced a painful withdrawal from Afghanistan, and that people are always remembering the last war, and so everyone was applying the analogy from Afghanistan to Ukraine. And while I don't want to discard that, I can't help but notice that this notion that Zelensky was going to flee and that the associated notion that Ukraine was going to fall apart went well beyond the United States. It was pretty broadly shared. So there's something to the Afghanistan analogy, but I think something more fundamental was going on, which has to do with freedom and risk, or more broadly with what freedom actually means. I think it has to do with something that in my other writings, I guess first On Tyranny and then in Road to Unfreedom, I call the politics of inevitability after 1989. And that is the sense, which sometimes goes under the name of there is no alternative. It sometimes goes under the name of the end of history. The sense, the very powerful sense, the very broadly shared sense that that all that was going to happen in the future was a kind of general convergence towards democracy and freedom. And underlying that analysis was the presumption or the assumption that democracy and freedom are the result of larger forces. The larger forces people had in mind were usually capitalism, maybe sometimes, American exceptionalism as an example for everyone, but some larger force was going to ensure that there was freedom and democracy. Now, this way of thinking about freedom and democracy has a lot of problems. It verges on being logically contradictory, because after all, if you're living in a world of inevitability, it's hard to imagine how you can then be free. If you're living in a world where everything is guided by larger forces, where are the people who rule? Where is democracy? How is that then possible? More practically, this kind of passivity about democracy and freedom breeds bad habits. If you assume that things are going to go your way, then you don't get into the habit of struggling, as Frederick Douglass says you must. You don't get into the habit of struggling for the value of freedom or for the value-laden system of democracy. Those muscles grow limp, right? Those reflexes die. But I think the relevant consequence here, when we think of February 2022, the relevant consequence of the politics of inevitability in that setting is this. If you've gotten used to thinking that democracy, freedom are the result of larger forces, then what do you do when the forces are arrayed against you? And of course, this is a question which doesn't only apply to a war in Ukraine. You can also apply it to an attempted coup or a financial crisis or any number of other things, a terrorist attack, any number of other things. If you think that your freedom and your democracy depend on larger forces, and then you meet a shock where it turns out that the larger forces aren't going your way, what do? What can you do? You run. That's all that you've got left. You run. And I think the fundamental reason why, and I say this with shame, but also in the hope that recognizing this will help us, I think the fundamental reason why so many people in North America and Europe assume that Zelensky would run is that that's what they would have done. Because from their point of view in Kyiv, if they had been in Kyiv, they would have thought the larger forces are against me. What else is there? What else is there? In democracy, freedom, they're the result of objective forces. Suddenly the objective forces are turned against us. You run. What else are you going to do? But he didn't run. He stayed. He chose to remain on the 22nd of February. The two words, the president is here, President tut, he uttered 3 days after that. He's remained in Kyiv ever since. And he and I should stress, a lot of other people who behaved very similarly have led a Ukrainian resistance, which has to do not only with the Ukrainian state, but with Ukrainian civil society. And then we, looking upon this from the outside, I think it's fair to say that we have then been divided into the astonished and the cynical. So people who are not somehow impressed by this are those who like Putin or like subjugation or like to be lied to. They're living in some kind of cynical, nihilistic world. And essentially the same, they're behaving as if nothing happened, right? And if Zelensky remaining in Kyiv doesn't make any impression on them, that's because nothing could make an impression on them. They're living their political life in a land of cynicism or nihilism. And then there are the astonished, and I'm struck by this, that the astonishment comes with a kind of uncertainty, of an inarticulateness about how to characterize what Zelensky has done. People know that it's somehow impressive, and they know that it was unexpected, but they're not quite sure what to say about it. And that astonishment for me, I mean, people who are astonished seem to me to be those who still have some kind of value commitment to freedom, but they're not sure how to characterize freedom as a matter of taking risks, right? Which is what the behavior demonstrates, that freedom can't be just a matter of some kind of objective laws about our three-dimensional world. It has to involve a commitment to values, which then brings about a corporeal or a bodily commitment. Freedom, democracy have to be a matter of taking risks, not just every risk, not taking risks on purpose, not taking risks for the sake of it, but taking thoughtful risks. But there's always going to be this element of freedom and democracy. Larger forces may push this way, they may push that way. But if you're going to be a free person, you have to confront the larger forces, alter the larger forces, find exceptions to the larger forces, sublimate the larger forces, trick the larger forces, do something with the larger forces besides expect that they're going to be on your side. You're going to have to take some kind of risk. This brings me to something that I did talk about with President Zelensky, and which seems to me to be an interesting but soluble problem for freedom. I'm going to characterize this. This is my third point, my third concept. I'm going to characterize this as freedom and obligation. So what I'm concerned with here is a situation in which it seems to you that a person is free, and yet the person himself or herself or themselves say that there's nothing else they could have done, right? Nothing else they could have done. So on the one hand, when I spoke to Zelensky about all this, I admit this is subjective, so you'll go with me or you won't, but I had the impression that I was talking to someone who was quite free. Like someone who, even though we're behind checkpoints, we're behind sandbags, even though we're talking during an important battle, even though he's been working incessantly for months, he's relaxed. He seems to be without complexes. He's open to talking about whatever. I told him I want to talk about philosophy, and he said, let's do that. And we talked about philosophy for a couple hours for the better part of the afternoon. So on the one side, this seems like a person, judging by comportment, as far as one can judge, who seemed to be very much a free person. On the other hand, when we talk about his decision to remain in Kyiv, his explanation for it, he circled around the same thing over and over again. He said, I could not have done otherwise. He said, I would not have been myself had I left. He said, I would not have respected myself if I had left. So here we seem to have, it's probably a stretch to call this a paradox, but I'm going to call it a paradox. I'm going to call it the Zelensky paradox. How might it be that someone who seems to be free by comportment, who's not restrained, right? He certainly could have left. Nothing was restraining him there in a physical sense. How does a person who is free, on the other hand, feel as though there was nothing else he could have done? I think the way to resolve this little paradox, this Zelensky paradox, and this is, by the way, how he and I talked about it and how I've been thinking about it for the book about freedom I've been trying to write this year. I think that this we can solve this if we think about freedom in the right way. And if we think about freedom in the right way as a kind of pluralist engagement with values over the course of a life, this apparent problem dissolves. So if we imagine freedom as the highest value because freedom is what allows us to engage with and choose among and realize all the other values. And then if we think about our life in its stages, in the correct temporal order, if we think about life as practice in making such choices, and we remember that these choices are going to involve subjective evaluations, they're going to involve unpredictable circumstances around us, they're going to involve, and this may be the most important thing, values that are themselves irreconcilable. You can't always get everything that you want at the same time. You have to kind of play tricks or try to combine or do one thing now, one thing later. That these choices are always going to involve imperfect outcomes, but imperfect outcomes that are laden with values and have consequences. So if we think about it that way, we think about freedom as this kind of pluralist engagement with a world of values that you can do because you're free. And then if we remember that over time we change and that all the decisions that we take are part of us as we make the next decision, then we could use an old-fashioned word and say that the person making these choices over time develops the thing that we could call character. And given character, a situation can then arise in which there really doesn't seem to be a choice, in the sense that it's clear what the right thing to do would be. But the reason why it's clear is because of the accumulation of free choices over the years. So it's precisely being a free person over time which generates that sensation at certain critical moments of life that there's really only one thing that can be done. So there's the solution to the Zelensky paradox, which was worked out not only about but with Zelensky. But I'm trying to make a serious point here, and I hope I have made a serious point about freedom and obligation, that freedom may involve the sense that there is one thing that one must do. The final point that I want to make, or the final issue area of freedom that I want to address, is freedom and security. So if I'm right in the way that I've been presenting freedom explicitly and implicitly here, then freedom is not something that you can really productively think about as being brought about by larger forces. Freedom doesn't amount also to just the absence of restraint. The absence of restraint is, of course, important, but the reason why you want the absence of restraint is so that you can become the person who, exercising freedom, makes choices among values and builds character, right? So the restraint isn't bad in and of itself. The restraint is bad because it prevents you from becoming a free person. And freedom is obviously not just doing what you want in a particular moment. It's not a matter of impulse, right? It's not a matter of yielding to impulse. It would be wrong. It would be right to say that Zelensky was behaving freely when he remained in Kyiv. But I think it would be wrong to say that he was doing that because it's what he wanted to do. Or I think it requires us to expansively abuse the sense of want, to say that that's what he wanted to do. It's what he believed he had to do, which is something a bit different. So freedom, in the way I've been discussing it, has to be discussed in a particular moment, like in a particular setting. Because it's meaningless without the particular circumstances, but also meaningless without the accumulation of experience in a particular person. It's meaningless to think about freedom unless you know something about the accumulated choices that a person has made, which has built up a certain kind of character. And the reason I'm stressing that is that I think a lot of the workaday thinking about freedom, or at least decision making in philosophy, involves hypothetical dilemmas where we're abstracting away from the person and that person's past. And the assumption is that when you abstract away from those things, you're generating a productive situation. And I think it's actually the opposite. I think that situation has to be unproductive. You're stripping away the things that you would actually need in order to be able to talk about freedom, or for that matter, about making a decision. So the freedom then for a person, as you get better at it, as you get more practiced at it, involves these choices among values, but not necessarily negating values, trying to affirm as many of them as you can and getting better at that, like getting better at affirming multiple values, getting better at affirming as many of them as you can, even though you can't affirm all of them. And I want to suggest that this itself is an important point, because freedom and security, it's an example of an American, but not just an American, tendency to imagine that you have to choose between one thing and another. So I think Americans have particularly been trained to see this as a conundrum since 9/11, but not only 9/11. The Cold War certainly had elements of this. The idea, and as I speak, the police siren. We're trained to think that there is a trade-off between freedom and security, and I think this is just wrong. You don't generally have to trade off freedom for security. I think generally when you trade off freedom, you get less secure. And I'm also going to note that in America, we make the same mistake the converse way. Namely, we think that you can't get more, that you have to get rid of security to get freedom. So we think, well, we can't have health insurance or whatever because that would make us less free. And that's also a mistake, right? So what I want to say is that freedom and security, not always, but generally go together. And I was struck by this point when it was made by President Zelensky. I think it was September when I was in Kyiv, September of 22, when he gave a public address when speaking of the Ukrainian army driving Russian forces out, he characterized that as returning freedom and security to villages. And if you think about it, that's of course intuitive. If you're stopping people, if you're disassembling a torture chamber, the people around are not only more free, they're also more secure. So when we talked about this, he said that the deprivation of freedom is insecurity, and and then he also later said insecurity is the deprivation of freedom. And all these formulations are not, I don't think they're perfect. I think they're much closer to the truth than the affirmation that there's a contradiction between freedom and security. So, I don't know how, I'm not going to try to describe the dominant way these things are debated in Canada. And I should say that certainly some of my arguments here have been influenced by a Canadian thinker, namely Charles Taylor. But there is a basic American problem here, that we think we have to trade freedom for security, in the sense that when we're in danger, we have to give up freedom. But we also think we have to trade security for freedom, in the sense that we think we have to give up on health, or give up on longer lives, or give up on give up on a sense of safety, give up on a sense of everyday safety. We have to give up these things in order to be free, right? And what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that this is all a sad error. This is all a mistake. That's simply a mistake. Freedom and security generally go together. Now, like a lot of things, it's a shame if it takes a war to see these things, but sometimes a war can help us to see more clearly, or to think more clearly, which is my thesis here. So, in conclusion, I have been talking about freedom in 4 connections: freedom and speech, freedom and risk, freedom and obligation, freedom and security. I have been arguing, with the help of what I've learned from President Zelensky, but also from many others, that freedom and speech go together, in that freedom of speech it has a purpose, which is to speak truth to power. And if we begin from that purpose, we'll end up in a more sensible place in our discussions about freedom of speech. And the 2 words the president is here, helped me with that, because it's a paradigmatic example of speaking truth to power. My second point had to do with freedom and risk. And the notion here is that freedom has to have some kind of non-material quality to it, whether you want to think of that as metaphysical or transcendental or whatever you choose. It has to have something which goes beyond being the end product of a predictable larger structure or larger forces. If we adopt the view that freedom simply is a kind of output, then we are making what verges on being a logical mistake, but which is certainly a political and social mistake and one of being less free. I addressed the apparent paradox of a person believing they're obliged to something, even be obliged to do something, there's no other choice, even when that person is free, which I called the Zelensky paradox. And I resolved it by an account of what I think freedom is, namely the higher value that allows us to choose among other values, but also the practice in choosing values, which allows us to build a character, and that character can face a set of circumstances in which it'll be clear what we ought to do. But that's an expression not of constraint, it's actually a result of a life in freedom. And then finally, at the end, I addressed the non-tension between freedom and security. So I tried to do all of this work on the basis of two words, which were spoken by the Ukrainian president, and then to some extent on the basis of my conversation with him about those words and about the setting, and about what he had in mind at the time. But I'd also like to stress that these arguments that I've been trying to put together have been a result of contact not just with the president. That's concentrating on him and on that moment is a way to crystallize all of this. But I've been struck in general in the last year that this flavor of argumentation about freedom is very widely shared. It has actually been documented by the fantastic Ukrainian reporter Natalia Gumenyuk. But the notion that freedom is, to use the philosophical term now, that freedom is positive is very broadly held in Ukraine. And this notion that that security and freedom go together also seems, in my anecdotal experience, to be very broadly held. One doesn't want to draw solace from war, but one can draw solace from people's ability to think and communicate and help others to think during a war. So my answer to this question, what good is philosophy? I'm not going to pretend to have an answer to that question. I am just going to suggest that it's been my experience that that thinking along with the people who have had to undergo this war can help us do philosophy better. At least is the wrong expression. Certainly with respect to the very important concept, which is freedom. So thank you very much for indulging me. It's a privilege to be with everyone here. It's a privilege to be able to talk about these concepts, and I, for one, feel enabled to do this by my friends and my colleagues in Ukraine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy, for an excellent talk and for participating in this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure my colleagues in Ukraine do too. I also want to thank everyone in the audience for attending and giving what you can. We will put some information up on the screen in a minute, and that will enable you to contribute to this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. Again, thanks to the audience, and thank you very much, Tim. Thanks everyone for attending this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. The title of the conference is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis, and it's designed to generate the support for establishing a Center for Civic Engagement at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. This center will provide support for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine who are working under very challenging circumstances. So any contribution you can make is much appreciated, and I encourage everybody who's watching to contribute. With that said, it's my pleasure to welcome Jonathan Wolff. Jonathan is Alfred Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government in the University of Oxford, and the Governing Body Fellow at Wolfson College, Oxford. He is the author of Ethics in Public Policy, A Philosophical Inquiry, and The Human Right to Health, and he has written numerous pieces of public philosophy for The Guardian, The New Statesman, and the Philosophers magazine. He also embodies what I see as an excellent relationship between the academy and sort of public policy and thinking about current affairs. And Jonathan is here to talk to us today about values and public policy. Jonathan, thanks so much for participating in this event, and the floor is yours.
Aaron, thank you so much for involving me in this really important initiative. And also thank you for that very kind introduction. So I'm going to talk about values and public policy, which is the part of the name title of my chair, and also what I have been trying to do for the last maybe 20, 25 years or so. So I teach philosophy in a public policy school, and a lot of our students have had a background in the policy world one way or another. Very few have studied philosophy or political philosophy before. And some are a little bit bemused at the idea that they're going to be studying philosophy as part of a public policy degree. But one of the things we say to them early on is that every question in public policy ultimately involves values in some way or other. In other public policy schools, they spend a lot of time doing cost-benefit analysis. Well, think of those words, cost and benefit. Cost and benefits are values. Someone has decided what's going to count as a cost, what's going to count as a benefit, and that other things are not. That decision was taken. Either you accept it or you question it and wonder whether they've got it right. Now, of course, if you're doing a small scale project, maybe now's not the time to question the methodology, but someone has to at some point. And this really came home to me with some of the public policy work I've done. One of the really unusual projects I got involved with was questions about railway safety in the UK, that there'd been a number of very high profile train crashes, and the railway industry had come under a lot of criticism from the unions, the public, and especially the quality newspapers, claiming that they had been somehow negligent with public safety. The industry didn't believe they were negligent, but they didn't know really how to answer the question philosophically. And so an enlightened statistician thought that they ought to read some philosophy. He read some textbooks. It didn't get him very far, so he thought he better call in a live philosopher to see what they could say. And railway safety or transport safety, how many philosophers have ever been involved with those questions, that there was nothing really to draw on? So I started to read the literature. And to my amazement, I saw that in order to make safety decisions, i.e. how much do we spend on an improvement, the industry was required to do, as I mentioned before, a cost-benefit analysis, and it put a price on life. Roughly speaking, at that time, if you could save a life, a statistical life, for less than £1 million, you had a duty to do it. And if it was going to cost you more than £1 million, you didn't, roughly speaking. I was staggered at this. Why £1 million? Why not 2 million? Why not 10 million? Why not £10? Where did that number come from? But more importantly, who said we should be putting a price on life? I thought that life was precious, almost sacred, that we shouldn't be putting a price on life. Human beings have a dignity, not a price, we're told by some great philosophers. But there was no philosophical discussion about this, or very, very little. So it amazed me that these philosophical decisions were being taken by engineers or by economists and not philosophers. And so I got intrigued about where we could, as philosophers, intervene in public life, maybe not solve problems, but join the debate and perhaps improve the quality of the debate. But how do we do that? And all of this started for me really with a chance phone call inviting me to take part in a review of gambling law in the UK. So I was very excited to get this. I was quite young, inexperienced in my career, and somehow someone had given the name to a committee, my name to a committee, and I was invited to join a committee that would make new recommendations about gambling law. Now, in my naivety, I thought that, well, first of all, this would be a very interesting way of spending some time, but also it wouldn't be very hard, because at that time, I'd already spent a decade or more of my life teaching John Stuart Mill and the idea that human beings have the right to intervene in the actions of other human beings only if they're likely to cause harm to third parties, that your own good is not a sufficient reason. I'd been telling students this. I thought I believed it. Well, I went to my first meeting of the committee thinking that I was going to solve all the problems by putting Mill's harm principle on the table, and then we could all settle questions about the regulation of gambling and all go home. But luckily I didn't say it out loud, because within a few seconds I realized that I didn't actually believe this principle after all. That is, the main reason for regulating gambling is to stop people harming themselves, is to stop people falling into addiction. Now, you could try to do some clever side steps to try to make that consistent with Mill's writings. Perhaps you say people don't have full autonomy, or they don't have autonomy, you don't have liberty, or you don't have freedom to make your own decisions. But that was all irrelevant. In the policy space, we have decided that we're going to stop people harming themselves in some cases. We make people wear seatbelts, we make them wear helmets on motorcycles, we stop them engaging in the most dangerous forms of drinking, and we stop them engaging in the most dangerous forms of gambling. And this is something we simply take for granted. So this was a big shock to me, because I thought, as a philosopher, my contribution to public policy would be to draw on the theories that I knew, apply them to policy issues, and deduce some consequences. But what I realized on that occasion is we've got to be much more careful than that, because the theories that we have are ones that may not be well adapted to the problems that we're going to encounter. Furthermore, there's a problem of why should anyone believe that particular theory? So if we go back to Mill's harm principle, the only reason for interfering with the liberty of any adult is to prevent harm to others. I might have said that out loud in the committee, but quite likely another committee member would have said, well, that's very interesting. So they always say that. That's very interesting. But who says that's the correct principle? Now, I did get that type of question every now and again when I was sitting on committees. And my instinct, well, I had two instincts. One was to say, well, no, that's not how you do philosophy. It's not a question of who says. It's a question of what are the arguments. But I didn't go down that line, because I knew the next question would be, well, what are the arguments? And I don't think I had them. I mean, I had a principle. We think we've got arguments for things, but more often we've got arguments from things rather than for the theories. So although I would say, you know, arguments from authority don't work in philosophy, actually we use them much more than we claim to do. The other thing that went through my mind, of course I didn't say this, is if they said, well, who says that's right? I might have said, well, I do, and you invited me and I'm the philosopher, so surely that's why I'm here. But of course, I'm not invited because I have special authority. I was invited because maybe I was going to help them think through some questions rather than dictate to them. So I learned very quickly that the way we think about doing applied philosophy is not a useful model. And actually, I don't think it is how we really do it in practice. So the way we're taught is that you come up with a theory. You might be a Kantian, you might be utilitarian, you might be a virtue theorist, you may be some other sort of sophisticated theorist. And you take that theory to public policy, you see a problem, you deduce the consequences from your theory in the light of that problem and come up with a policy solution. That's the model we've sort of assumed. And that sometimes you see this in textbooks, and when people talk about doing applied philosophy, you take the philosophy and you apply it. But in my view, that is a very bad approach. It's dogmatic. We don't have the arguments. It typically doesn't address the problems that we're really faced with. And often we come up with completely implausible recommendations, as in the case of gambling. So if you'd applied the Millian principle to gambling, we would have had a very libertarian regime about gambling, one that no country has ever followed. Actually, even the most libertarian countries, the United States, say have limits on gambling, quite severe limits on gambling. And in fact, as a young man, John Stuart Mill wrote against gambling, even though as a more mature thinker, his principles seem to encourage it, or at least allow it. So what I've done in some of my work is to contrast two different models of connecting philosophy and policy. One I called applied philosophy, which is the model I described, where you take a theory and you apply that theory to public policy. The other I call engaged philosophy. Now, other people have called it bottom-up philosophy. There are many names for the same thing, and I'm not claiming to be original at all in what I do here, although people have not tended to describe in detail how this method works. And this model of engaged philosophy, really, we start with a problem. That is, we don't start with a theory, we start with a problem. And in the case, say, of railway safety, the problem was that there were some train crashes, and there was pressure on the industry to spend much more money on train safety. But because so few people were dying in accidents, it was going to cost an absolute fortune to make the railways even a little bit safer. And was that the best way of spending our money as a society? Maybe we should have put it into the health service or overseas development rather than making the railways a little bit safer. In the case of gambling, the main problem is, on the one hand, adults should be able to do what they want. On the other hand, some people are vulnerable, they get addicted, they harm themselves a lot. In the worst cases, they lose so much money, they very sadly take their own lives. So we have this balance between around about 99% of those who gamble, gambling without any harm, and about 1% of those who gamble get into problems, and 1% of 1% get into very serious problems. So our question is, how do we balance the pleasures of the great majority against very severe harm to a very small number? So that's where we start. And what we need to do is understand the current regulations. What do we currently do? Because philosophers quite often will make a recommendation, not really understanding how the world already is, having not done that work. So we need to understand the state of the world. We need to understand the problems and dilemmas. We also need to understand history, and gambling cases is one that illustrates this very well, because some philosophers who have looked at issues of gambling have thought that what we ought to do is ban gambling. There ought to be laws against gambling. One of the peculiarities of gambling regulation is that there are still quite high prevalence rates of problem gambling among populations for whom it's illegal to gamble. So it's illegal for under 18s to gamble, but there's quite a lot of problem gambling among under 18s. So what are they doing? They're finding ways of gambling that are consistent with the law, or getting around the law. That is, laws don't enforce themselves. And there was a time when most gambling was illegal in the UK, and about a quarter of the adult population in some towns were breaking the law on a regular basis. So it just brought the law into disrepute. So when you look at the history, you actually see you've got a much more limited policy space than you think. So in the approach I recommend, you need to immerse yourself in a lot of empirical issues before you have the temerity to make any type of recommendation or argument. So a number of preliminaries. One, you need to understand the dilemma as it is, as it affects people in real life. What is the policy debate? Can you get behind it? Can you reconstruct it in a way that is philosophically more rigorous and brings out the issues around paternalism, say, or autonomy or harm, appealing to the values that are most relevant in that policy question rather than the ones that are in your theory. So you need to understand the policy area and understand what the real policy dilemmas are. You need to understand history. You need to understand current regulations. It does you a lot of good to compare other countries, because most countries have very similar problems and will have dealt with them in different ways. And it's possible to be inspired by what we see abroad. So in the UK, we tend to look to other English-speaking countries first, maybe the Netherlands, Scandinavia. We don't look at Latin America. We don't look at Africa. We don't look at East Asia. But all of these countries have very similar problems to ours, maybe in a different form, and maybe we can get inspired on a solution by looking at good practice elsewhere. But the reason for doing all of this is to try to understand the policy options. So we have the problem. What can we actually do? And what would be the effect of doing it? So some policies look great, but when you put them in practice, they backfire. I have this sort of almost a macabre hobby of collecting examples of policies that go wrong and achieve the exact opposite of the aim they have. So some policies around housing security have made the housing market extremely insecure because it's changed the way in which landlords have been prepared to rent property. Same thing happens around employment legislation. You have to be very, very careful how you frame the legislation if it's going to have the effect you want. Roughly speaking, because regulators don't have a personal stake in making the regulations right, but businesses have a personal stake in finding ways around them. And so pretty much any regulation that comes in, someone's going to try and work out a way of defeating that. And the way I convince academics of this is to say, if your department is doing something you think is right, the administration brings in a new regulation to stop you doing it, do you stop doing it, or do you find another way of doing it which is compliant with the regulation? And we all do the second, and that is what human beings do when they see a regulation they don't agree with. So our policy space is limited. We have to be very clever, we have to be very flexible, and we have to try to anticipate consequences. So where is the philosophy in any of this? Well, we'll have a range of policy options, and some of them will advance some values, others will advance other values. Some will be good for the majority, but harmful for a minority. Some will be better for the worst off, but we will have fewer overall benefits. So when we're evaluating the policy options, we start looking at philosophical arguments as well as others. And I think our job is simply to bring those to the surface, to help bring them to the surface. Because I don't think as philosophers we have a special module in our minds that other people don't have. It's not as if there's something we're doing which is special. What we're doing is continuous with what ordinary people do in their debates in the pub, in the restaurants, around the dinner table, what journalists do, what civil servants do, what other academics do. Our speciality is, roughly speaking, it's all we do. That is, we spend all our time thinking about these arguments, and we've got a large stock of patterns of argument and history to draw on. So what we do as philosophers is contribute to a debate by clarifying, by bringing new information, by thinking more imaginatively, by showing that one thing is consistent or inconsistent with another thing, that if you want this, then you better take this other thing as well. So we're contributing to a debate that's already taking place, making it better, I think. And in the end, helping in the committees I've worked with and the policies I've worked on, helping to make some recommendations, which may or may not be accepted. And I'll just end with a point about humility for philosophy. That most academics want to be highly original. They want to be the one person who said something that makes all the difference. That's not really how public policy works. The way public policy works is lots of people saying, broadly speaking, the same thing over and over again in different contexts until it finally goes in. So if you want to be a unique voice, stick to the scholarly debate, stick to the journals. If you want to make a contribution to public policy, you have to form alliances, you have to put your voice to things other people are saying, maybe you have to make pragmatic compromises so that there's a broad consensus between different positions, rather than thinking that you're going to be the one true prophet. I mean, I'm sure there are occasional examples of the one true prophet, but they're pretty rare. And more often it's about joining a movement or being one voice among many. Now, this may sound a very modest role for philosophy, but I think it's very important, because what we're doing is making people aware that they're facing value conflicts, and they have to think about them in philosophical terms, not just apply their formulas that they might have from economics or elsewhere. So I think I will stop on that note. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Joe, for the excellent talk. I have a lot of questions as somebody who does a fair bit of, let's say, public philosophy, not necessarily public policy applied public philosophy. But if you don't mind, I have a couple quick follow-ups here. So on the one hand, we have what you've called applied philosophy, which you described as dogmatic. And it seems like part of the reason is dogmatic is it doesn't respect that there's some kind of gap between whatever your theory is and the particular history of the problem or phenomenon you're trying to understand. And so just applying the theory to that is dogmatic. and may not get us anywhere. It may do more harm than good, potentially. Um, so you develop an alternative engaged philosophy, which involves sort of immersing yourself in concrete particular problems and ultimately helping people sort of think things through. Now, I wonder if a philosopher is going to try to do that. Does this mean that they kind of have to be a much broader philosopher than your typical academic? That is, you're better at engaging in public policy debates if you're not a Kantian or a utilitarian, but you know something about the whole history of philosophy and can draw on all different sides of looking at these problems. Is that the kind of model, if you wanted to engage in public policy, that you need to be a very sort of broad minded philosopher with a broad understanding of the history of philosophy and debates to actually bring up the different issues that people are thinking about when they're thinking about policy? Is this how you see it, or?
Mm-hmm. Well, I should make clear that I think there's more than one sort of intervention point. So if I talk about another issue I was involved with, the ethics of animal experimentation. Now, there's a lot of work around this. So the work of Peter Singer, at the time I was looking at it, Peter Carruthers, and they had particular worked out philosophical positions. Now, if I had gone into my committee saying I'm a true born Singerite, if that's the word, and the only thing I'm going to countenance is all animals are equal and we've got to close down the labs, people have said, well, that's very interesting, but they would have got a different philosopher for the committee. It would have been no help to them because that wasn't a live option. Mm-hmm. So do I think that Singer is useless? Absolutely not. What Singer has done is put arguments into the debate that has actually changed the terms of the debate. So people are taking positions seriously now that they wouldn't have done before. So I think we need the Kantians, we need the utilitarians, we need the virtue ethics theorists, we need novel theorists, we need people who think really hard and deeply about a theoretical approach, because they're like the store cupboard. But most of the work I've been doing is much further on, much closer to actually having to take a decision. And when you take a decision, what you need to do, I think, is start from the real life policy dilemmas, see what is worrying people. And it's very unlikely to be the best interpretation of Kant that's worrying people on the ground. It's going to be something, normally, actually, it's something to do with the common good versus individual rights versus maybe something about the character of how people are acting, and now much more our relation with the natural world and animals and climate. So there's certain things that are going to be really important. One needs to think about that. Whereas if you were to approach these issues and say, well, the only thing that matters to me is Schopenhauer's pessimism or something like this, and I can tell you how to see it through that, you can say, well, that could be a contribution to the debate, but it's not going to solve it. But we do need, it's almost paradoxical, because philosophy needs people who think they can solve all the problems with one theory, because otherwise they wouldn't be developing that theory. And the rest of us need those obsessive, single-minded philosophers to carry on to do the work so we can do our work in the public policy space.
Okay, great. Maybe just a quick follow-up on that, because we sort of began with dogmatism of applied philosophy. And it seems like the kind of philosophy you're doing is, let's call it engaged philosophy, is meant to bust the dogmatism of the people who are charged with making policy. So it's more about sort of questioning the assumptions of policymakers. Is this part of the project? You come in, they use cost benefit analysis, and then you're like, but what do you mean by this? And it forces people to some ways think like philosophers. Is this sort of what's happening?
Yeah. So yes and no. So I like this idea that it's changing people to think like philosophers. But I wouldn't myself do it by challenging people or saying, what do you mean by that? Or putting people on the defensive. I think we do much better by making people realize they're already philosophers without understanding what they're doing. And so to show them that they're already using values and they could do with a bit more thought about it, and to help them think about other things they could be looking at or contrasting values. I think one of the problems is that the philosophical impulse of always questioning does put people on the defensive, and it does give us a bad reputation. So on one committee, I think there was someone who didn't realize I was a philosopher who said, we were talking about expanding the committee, and she said, please, no philosophers. We don't want people coming and telling us we're doing everything wrong. And so I thought this was how philosophers are perceived. We're a type of thought police that are saying, no, you can't say that, that's wrong. Whereas I prefer to use a sort of midwife metaphor, I suppose, to help bring out what's already there, and to help people see that they are already doing this type of work, and just to help them do it a bit better.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I want to say thanks very much for participating in this benefit for the Ukrainian Academy. I appreciate your time. I'm sure my Ukrainian colleagues do too. And I just want to thank everyone for attending. If you can make a contribution, it would be much appreciated. And Jonathan, thanks so much. It was a pleasure.
Well, it was absolutely my honor and privilege to take part. Thank you so much for including me, Aaron.
Thanks everyone for attending this benefit event for the Ukrainian Academy. The title of the conference is What Good is Philosophy? The Role of the Academy in a Time of Crisis. And it's meant to generate support to establish a Center for Civic Engagement at Kyiv Mohyla Academy. This center will provide support for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine who are doing excellent work in very difficult and challenging circumstances. We'll put up a slide after the talk to give you the relevant information to contribute, and we appreciate you giving what you can. That said, it's my pleasure to welcome Jason Stanley. Jason is the Jacob Urowski Professor of Philosophy and Linguistics at Yale University. He is the author of 5 books, including Knowledge and Practical Interests, How Propaganda Works, and How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. In the fall of 2023, The Politics of Language, co-authored with David Beaver, will be published with Princeton University Press. Today, Jason will be speaking us about the discourse of genocide, and I just want to say thank you for participating in this benefit, Jason, and over to you.
Thank you so much for setting up this extraordinarily important event. So the topic of this conference is what good is philosophy? And I think there's probably no one answer to that question. There's each of our individual answers. The way I'm going to approach the topic of this conference is to chart my own path through philosophy, which is deeply intermingled with the events happening now in Ukraine. So I'm the child of 2 Holocaust survivors, and I entered the field of philosophy with one question, and that was why? How can a democratic society slide so rapidly into fascism and war and mass killing? You might think that the austere structures of analytic philosophy would be a poor avenue to pursue these questions. But historically, these questions are at the very center of our field. Fascism itself is a concept that is novel. It requires nationalism. It requires European nationalism for its understanding. But it's an anti-democratic formation. It's an anti-democratic formation whose original essence can be traced back to the concepts in Book 8 of Plato's Republic, in his reply to the dangers of democracy, and his argument that democracy leads straightforwardly to tyranny. A tyrant, Plato argues, can achieve great popularity by constantly fomenting war and split the population and draw support for his own tyranny. And these are structures that we see investigated in the field of philosophy time and time again through the centuries since Plato. Philosophy is indeed footnotes to Plato in this regard. But entering analytic philosophy, I was compelled first by the role language plays in such events. I wanted to understand how language can draw emotion, can foment antagonism. Instead, I spent many years studying the abstract formal features of language. And it has taken me decades to circle back around to the questions that first brought me into this field. But I want to emphasize that time spent with the austere structures, time spent with the exactness of this field has enabled my work to, I hope, speak to these questions of fundamental structural importance. Topics at the very heart of the Ukraine war, fascism, ultranationalism, colonialism, these are democracy. What the Ukraine war represents to the world is the threat democratic regimes pose to the kind of self-glorification that is at the very basis of a fascist regime. And Vladimir Putin's Russia is, I take it, the paradigm example right now of a fascist regime. So what I have done, this path I've taken over the past 12, 15 years now, is to try to apply the lessons I learned and the tools and methods I learned in my philosophical training to understand how propaganda can turn people against democracy, how propaganda can be used, how speech and propaganda from politicians, from a public, can turn people against freedom, equality, equal mutual respect for other groups. These questions have been explored in traditions, have been continuously explored in traditions not my own, in continental philosophy. But I firmly believe that my own tradition of analytic philosophy has something to bring to bear to these questions. So what I've done when you look at something like propaganda, you're looking at the relationship between attitudes, structures, and speech. How attitudes, structures, and speech can combine to do something anti-democratic or democratic, but can have an effect. So you can't look at these structures in isolation. You have to look at them. You have to look at them together. So what I was one of the things that analytic philosophy did is look at sort of speech straightforwardly. It looked at straightforward cooperative speech, which is not the form that propaganda takes. It is not the form that hate speech and genocidal speech take. So without deviating from as it were, the values, methodology, rigor of my home base of analytic philosophy, I've tried in my work to look at these forms of non-cooperative speech. Now, what I found very early on was that people who are subject to propaganda, like the Ukrainian population, is very aware of things that, if you're not subject to that population, might take you years to figure out. So I was first invited to Kyiv in 2017 to keynote the School of Political Thought's annual conference. And I spoke on propaganda, and I found that my audience was extremely conversant with the methods of propaganda. The things that I had been studying theoretically, they had experienced practically. And so there's a serious question of how much we can do theoretically, because being subject to the forces that we investigate theoretically gives you the kind of lesson you can't get in the university alone. But I think it's vital to see that philosophy has always been about, it has always wrestled with these questions of democracy. It has always wrestled with a question of how democracies can be stable in the face of propaganda. Plato's challenge to democracy was that democracy is not a stable system, because democracy is a system that allows anyone to run for office, and a leader will run who foments internal and external enemies, and is constantly at war, as Plato says, constantly foments war as a means of drawing support. This is why you find fascist leaders constantly driven towards war and often very popular because of it. So much democratic political philosophy is devoted to solving this problem, responding to this problem. Rousseau, in his work, is looking at how democracy is possible in the face of this issue. And his answer is to inure a population to the temptations of ultranationalism, of high self-regard for their own identities, by an education system that foments amour de soi rather than amour propre. One is, why is it today that the Russian people have been so conditioned to respond to Ukrainian independence as a fundamental threat to their identity? Because as I've argued in my writings on Ukraine in the last year, because the Russian identity has been formed to structure Ukrainian independence as a fundamental threat, Ukrainian identity as an existential threat. So a Ukrainian identity, what we've seen in Russian propaganda, such as what historian Timothy Snyder calls Russia's genocide handbook, What Should Russia Do with Ukraine, published by R.I.A. Novisti. The goal there is to say the idea that Ukraine is an independent people, that idea that they're not just other Russians, is a fundamental threat to the very existence of Russian identity. And so what I've tried to do in my theoretical work is explain how people can be drawn to this kind of propaganda, to be sending their children to death in a battle for this ideological construct. And the history of philosophy, the history of democratic political philosophy, is about much of the history is about how you resist this. Rousseau's Emile is how we construct people, how we have an education system, so people will not respond to these attempts to make them identify themselves in terms of hatred of the other. So what I've been doing to make the way I've been using my philosophical toolkit in philosophy of language, nurtured through analytic philosophy, but supplanted by our long history, is try to sketch out the preconditions for mass killing, the preconditions for the end of democracy, the preconditions for fascism, and sadly, this work is not just of historical resonance, it's of great resonance right now as we face a global fascist movement. And drawing on the history of philosophy, drawing on figures like Rousseau, like Dewey, whose work helped in denazification post World War II. It aided the German people in coming to an understanding of a democratic education. I've drawn on that long history of philosophy that thinks about how people use self-regard, how leaders use self-regard, national pride, other kinds of pride in monarchy and dynasties, the forms of pride that existed before 19th century European nationalism. I've tried to draw on those to illuminate not just the conditions that lead to mass killing, but the conditions that lead to the abandonment of democracy, but also increasingly the solutions. So I personally have used philosophy as the basis for my public-facing work. I've been writing on Ukraine for many of the world's newspapers, from Folha de Sao Paulo to The Guardian and others, trying to frame the importance of the fight we face, the world faces in Ukraine, which is, I think, a battle between the kind of self-regarding imperialist ultranationalism that is the form of the threat to democracy today, to democratic autonomy, which is what Ukraine represents. So that struggle in some form or other is really the foundation of our discipline. It's really how democratic political philosophy arises in response to that struggle, and trying to inure us and protect us from the temptations to abandon democracy for high self-regard. My work specifically on Ukraine, for instance, I've written about how I've used my philosophy of language, my new book, Politics of Language. It's intended to illuminate genocidal speech. So a core example is Russian propaganda. Russian propaganda functions by creating a genocidal antagonistic group. It tries to define Russian identity in contradistinction to Ukraine. Like, to be Russian is to eliminate Ukrainians. And it overlaps, is very similar to Nazi talk about Jews. Nazi talk about Jews defines Aryanness, the great enemy of Aryans, as the world Jewish conspiracy. This is not foreign to philosophy, this kind of investigation. The kind of investigation, the question for us, the question that many philosophers have faced in the democratic political philosophy tradition, is how to retain democracy against, and how to recognize in the face of threats to it, how to recognize the attractions that a structure like fascism poses, or monarchy, that a structure, that anti-democratic structures focus, that tyrants pose to democracy. So in my work has been entirely devoted in the last 15 years to this question of how you get a group of people who clearly don't benefit themselves in any material way from abandoning democracy and entering mass killing of another group, nevertheless to do that, and to understand that it is a constant human temptation. This is a theme that people tell me, oh, well, why is this philosophy? And my response is, this has always been philosophy. This has been the heart of our discipline from its inception in Athens. Topics like colonialism, imperialism, that right now the Ukraine war faces, are topics that are at the center of classical Greek thought. Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, is all about democracy, oligarchy, and colonialism. Athens was simultaneously a democracy and an empire. In Cleon's speech in the Mytilenean debate, where Cleon is asking the Athenian people, he's pleading with them to massacre the entire population, Mytilenean population. His argument is that you cannot be both a democracy and an empire. You have to choose. That is one of that speech is the oldest example, the prime example of Greek demagoguery. The prime example of deep Greek demagoguery poses an opposition between democracy and empire, between imperial brutality, mass killing, and democratic values. And Cleon sets those out in opposition. And to me, he's not wrong. He just made the wrong choice. And those issues, going back to those issues and emphasizing that philosophy has always been about those issues, and democratic political philosophy is devoted to showing how we can protect democracy from the temptations of imperialism, empire, and tyrants. So it is I view the philosophical life as a life that is lived in two worlds. You must simultaneously pay attention to what's going on in the world, and it must inform your philosophical practice, and your philosophical work must be devoted to elucidating and helping understand what is going on, not by lecturing those subject to it, who, as I discovered from my time in Ukraine in 2017, are well aware of how propaganda undermines democracy, but by centering their voices, using, in my case, I try to center the voices of the national minority threatened in my country, who've always been working on these topics, the Black intellectual tradition. But to try to explain that we all face these threats, it's not something that happens in a foreign country, but sometimes, as in this moment today, what is happening in foreign lands is and should be the center of this age-old philosophical tension between democracy on the one hand and imperialist mass killing and brutality on the other. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, for your inspiring talk. I have a couple quick questions if you have a few minutes. Maybe in some ways just to get a bit more kind of concrete in detail about the relationship between your background in analytic philosophy and the more public work that you're doing, specifically in the case of Ukraine currently. So I'll begin, like you paint this picture of sort of analytic philosophy typically works on normal cooperative speech. And there's already a deviation there when we talk about, let's say, extraordinary speech, speech used to cultivate sort of propaganda. That's different than what analytic philosophy typically works on. So I maybe have a question a bit about how analytic philosophy, which normally works on cooperative speech, is able to then adjust itself to deal with extraordinary speech. But then maybe a good way to think about this is precisely through the Ukraine example. So you gave us the idea that in Russia, propagandists create this notion of the Ukrainian other, which is an existential threat to the very existence of Russian identity. And this fosters Putin's ability to get the average everyday Russian supporting his initiatives in Ukraine. And so I wonder at a kind of a fine level how analytic philosophy helps us understand the speech Putin is using. What are the tools of analytic philosophy that explain that speech and how that speech works? If you could give us a couple examples, I think it would be really helpful for our listeners.
Great. So what David Beaver and I have done in our book, The Politics of well, first I should start off in my 2015 book, How Propaganda Works. I tried to address propaganda within a very conservative frame of analytic philosophy of language. I tried to incorporate othering, things like othering in terms of informational messages, like those people are bad or those people are enemies. I don't think that will work. I think that sticking to a pure informational model is not going to work. But yet, by developing our tools and concepts on an informational model, we have a kind of rough structure. We analytic philosophers of language have created a kind of rough structure. What David Beaver and I do in our book, The Politics of Language, is we generalize that rough structure. So we argue that a core function of language, so the transmission of information is one core function of language, but equally importantly is the formation of social identity. And the formation of social identity is not done via some derivative method by conveying information. The formation of social identity is done by sharing a language, simply sharing a language. So the very existence of the Ukrainian language, you can set up the very existence of Ukrainian language as a threat. We often think of nationalism as based on race, but Fichte's addresses to the German nation centers German greatness on the greatness of the German language. And so, the very fact that the Ukrainian language is taken as such a threat, that when Russia is the areas under Russian control, they extinguish the Ukrainian language, they put everything into Russian, shows you that reflection of nationalism. So simply speaking the same language, speaking the same vernacular, is a way of creating a joint social identity, eliminating an opposing language. Like the very fact that these people who the Russian Empire is saying we're always Russians speak a different language is meant as an affront. And then the idea that then the construction of another structure that is happening is using language to erase a history that demarcates the Ukrainian people as having a distinct cultural and historical cultural history and just history and tradition, particularly one of oppression. So Holodomor was a famine directed by Stalin against the Ukrainian people. The Russians have a historic responsibility implicated in that genocide. Russia has used certain techniques to mask that. They've argued that it was an administrative error. The famine targeted everyone. It was bureaucratic. It was a bureaucratic speech. It was a bureaucratic error. In other words, they've used certain kinds of linguistic explanations to try to mask the ethnic targeting.
Right. So you're looking at how, in precise ways, you're drawing on your analytic training to look at how they use speech to cultivate the other, and then through that cultivation of the other, they then use whatever power they gain through that cultivation to exploit other people and pursue their own ends. And it's kind of precisely your work in analytic philosophy that helps you understand how this works.
I wouldn't say precisely. I would say as well. I would say as well. It's what you want is you want a model for how non-cooperative and cooperative speech work with concepts that are general for both. So what the problem of when thinking about genocidal speech, when thinking about the speech about anti-democratic speech generally, what you have to do is you really have to change the concepts that come from thinking about cooperative speech alone. But you have to do it together. So
can you give me an example?
So the concept of presupposition. So the concept of presupposition is a concept that developed within analytic philosophy of language. You presuppose a proposition when you use. So if I say I'm picking up my sister from the airport, you presuppose the proposition that you have a sister. By generalizing the concept of presupposition, so it can apply to emotions, social identity. A way of speaking can presuppose a shared social identity. Similarly, accommodation, which is when you accommodate to the speech of others. Someone makes a presupposition that you didn't know, and you straight away, in David Lewis's terms, accept that presupposition. We have a more general notion of accommodation as harmonization. So you don't just accept the presuppositions; you accept what we call attunements, the emotions you're supposed to feel. So in mass politics, when someone is talking to you, they're asking you to accept certain emotions, to attune yourself to certain emotions. And so you have to broaden this to talk about social identity, emotions, and practices. To be Russian, the Russian propaganda tells us, is to revel in the suffering and extinction of Ukrainians. And that reveling is not just a matter of information. It's a matter of presupposing and accommodating social identities, practices, and emotions.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for your time, Jason. I really appreciate your talk, and I'm sure the Ukrainians who I'm working with appreciate your time too. I encourage everyone who's attending this benefit event to contribute what you can to this initiative. We'll put something up on the screen to help you do that in a minute. And I just want to say thanks again for participating, Jason. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for setting this up, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks everybody for attending What Good is Philosophy, benefit conference for Ukraine. My name is Aaron Wendland. I'm Vision Fellow in Public Philosophy at King's College London, and I'm the host of this benefit initiative. The conference is designed to raise funds for students, scholars, and publicly engaged academics in Ukraine who could use support at this time of great need. It's my pleasure today to introduce Seyla Benhabib. Seyla is Eugene Mayer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy Emeriti at Yale University. She is currently scholar in residence at Columbia Law School. Professor Benhabib is the recipient of the Ernst Bloch Prize, the Leopold Lucas Prize, and the Meister Eckhart Prize. She has written or co-edited over 15 books, including Situating the Self, Gender, Community, and Postmodernism in Contemporary Ethics, The Rights of Others, Aliens, Citizens, and Residents, and Exile, Statelessness, and Migration, Playing Chess with History from Hannah Arendt to Isaiah Berlin. The title of her talk today is Philosophers' Dreams of Perpetual Peace and the War in Ukraine. Seyla, thanks so much for being here, and over to you.
Thank you, Aaron, in particular for your tireless efforts in organizing this and for pulling those of us who are used to more abstract cogitations into this effort. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Immanuel Kant begins his famous essay, Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch written in 1795 at the end of the revolutionary wars between France and Prussia with a well-known joke. Kant writes, quote, "A Dutch innkeeper once put the satirical inscription zum ewigen Frieden, which in German means also eternal peace, written on tombstones of the dead. A Dutch innkeeper once put the satirical inscription on his signboard, along with the picture of a graveyard," writes Kant. "We shall not trouble to ask whether it applies to men in general, or particularly to heads of state who can never have enough of war, or only to the philosophers who blissfully dream of perpetual peace," end of quote. Whether it is humanity at large, or leaders of states, or maybe even philosophers alone who dream the sweet dream of eternal or perpetual peace, is a moot question, says Kant. The point is that one can enjoy the sweet dream of perpetual peace, not in life, but only in death, it seems. Of course, Kant, who proceeds to propose preliminary and definitive articles of peace among states in this essay, is himself aware of the irony that accompanies his project, or what he calls his Entwurf. Yet he is not deterred from trying to make perpetual peace among nations possible, despite the irony of the situation. Surely, in view of one of the most significant land wars on the European continent since the end of World War II, but not to forget the Yugoslav wars of 1992 to 2001, many have remembered Kant's joke in view of the current situation in Ukraine. The Russian aggression towards Ukraine and its people has raised hard questions yet again about the status of international law, and in particular about the status of the United Nations Charter, which outlaws war except in cases of self-defense. Chapter 7, Article 51 reads, quote, "Nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-determination if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures to maintain international peace and security," end of quote. The Security Council resolution of a year ago, on February 25, 2022, held Russia accountable for violating Ukrainian sovereignty, international law, and the UN Charter. But since Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, it vetoed the resolution. Perhaps more dismaying than Russia's veto is the fact that the UN General Assembly vote condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine and calling for its withdrawal resulted in 141 votes for, 35 abstentions, and 5 votes against. The countries supporting predictably were Belarus, North Korea, Eritrea, and Syria. But abstaining were not only China, Cuba, and Nicaragua, but many countries of the global south, such as Congo, El Salvador, Mali, Mozambique, Pakistan, South Africa, Uganda, Vietnam, and Zimbabwe as well. Countries whom one would have thought would be sympathetic to the plight of a smaller nation being attacked by a superpower. How can we account for this? Did these countries abstain because of their past loyalty to the Soviet Union and not to the Russian Federation? This seems to have been the case for South Africa, whose African National Congress had been supported by the Soviet Union during its long years of struggle. India, by contrast, was brazen in acknowledging its interest in continuing weapons and energy deal with Russia. For the rest, the most common argument was about the hypocrisy of the big powers using the United Nations and international law to their own ends, condemning certain invasions and violations of sovereignty while condoning others, such as the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq by Western coalition forces led by the US, for example. Volumes have been written about the current dysfunctional setup of the Security Council, which privileges the 5 permanent members who have veto power, thus making it impossible to reform the UN Charter, such as to accommodate the criticisms, I think some of them justified, as well as aspirations of many countries from the global south. Their vote in abstaining expresses their profound distrust and lack of faith in the universalist premises of the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and institutions of international law, unfortunately. The World Society of States, then, far from displaying a normative order, seems to be in a condition of perpetual normative disorder. But there is also a new challenge on the political horizon which threatens to change the post-World War II system of sovereign territoriality and respect for human rights altogether, with all its hypocrisies and contradictions. Without getting completely lost in the noise and confusion of everyday politics, I want to note that Russia's invasion of Ukraine did not even engage in the usual practice of state apology. No principle of self-defense, nor some other threat posed by Ukraine to Russia was invoked. Instead, Mr. Putin stipulated a primordial and mythic unity of the Russian and Ukrainian peoples in the name of Ruski Mir. Ukrainian territory was said to be an integral and indivisible part of this Großraum, a term made famous by the Nazi German philosopher Carl Schmitt, sphere of influence. Ukrainian territory was said to be an integral and indivisible part of this Ruski Mir, of this Großraum, in clear contradiction to the express will and political aspirations of the Ukrainian people themselves, who declared their independence from the Russian Federation in 1991, and who for the next 20 years tried to assert their democratic independence through the Maidan and many other movements. But what is emerging is a concept of territoriality understood in terms of primordialist claims and situated in some mythic history. Such primordialism brings a shift from the vocabulary of human rights and international law to a language of ethnic kinship and solidarity. The shameful discrepancy in the treatment of Afghani, Iraqi, and other refugees caught in the border between Belarus and Poland in the winter of 2022, when contrasted with the warm reception of fleeing Ukrainians by the European Union, has often been pointed to. Don't misunderstand me. Ukrainian refugees deserve and are entitled to the best treatment. But so were at least some of the Afghani and Iraqi refugees who were entitled at least to an asylum intake interview by the Polish government, that is a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. Confronted with such inconsistencies and contradictions in world politics, the inclination of most philosophers, since Plato, is to turn away from the sound and fury of human follies. War is a difficult topic for philosophy, precisely because it represents the breakdown of reason and rational argumentation in the conduct of human affairs. Whatever its permutations may have been throughout the centuries, understanding the universe around us and human actions and institutions rationally has remained the telos of philosophy. But there has also been a competing tradition of anti-rationalism extending from Machiavelli and Hobbes to Nietzsche and Freud, all of whom who see reason as being driven by the passions and emotions it cannot control. For this tradition, war is no surprise. There is also another strand of philosophical thinking about war, whose main aim is to enable that peace endures, and that even if wars are inevitable, they must be controlled by moral principles worthy of human dignity. Kant, with whom I started this lecture, is the foremost thinker of this tradition, who, while accepting that conflicts among nations may be inevitable, nevertheless formulated rational principles through which such conflicts could be resolved peacefully. In John Rawls's words, Kant developed a realist utopia for peace among nations. I'd like to call attention only to two of Kant's claims, which are worth remembering maybe in our current world situation. The first definitive article of Perpetual Peace, to which I referred at the beginning, states, quote, "The civil constitution of every state shall be republican." What does that mean? In a republic, the principles of freedom for all members of society, dependence upon a common legislation as subjects, and legal equality for everyone as citizens should be guaranteed. That's why Kant says that the Republican Constitution, which respects equality and freedom under the law for all, is also the ideal, most compatible with his famous moral law, the categorical imperative. But he further claims that such a Republican Constitution would serve peace because the consent of the citizens would never be given for declaring war. He says it is unlikely that if consulted, citizens would, quote, call upon themselves all the miseries of war. And of course, not to forget that Kant is still writing in the age of absolutism. He is not writing in an age when democratic constitutionalism has become the norm. Nonetheless, this claim of Kant's has become known in political science as the theorem of democratic peace, namely that democracies do not make war against each other. The democratic peace theory may have been plausible in the period after two world wars started by authoritarian and totalitarian regimes in Europe. But in a multipolar world after the end of the Cold War, and in the age of nuclear weapons, democratic powers instead engage in unending proxy wars. And this is the danger that the Ukrainian people face today. I agree that under no circumstances must Ukraine lose. But is it possible to stop an endless war and respect the principle of consent by holding a referendum under internationally monitored bodies in the contested regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia? I know this is controversial, but it can also reveal the sham referenda promoted by Russia and would respect the will of the people of these regions if properly internationally monitored and held. And here I'm thinking a little bit of the century-old conflict about Alsace-Lorraine between France and Germany. Principle of consent could be possibly applied, but of course the will of the people must be respected. Second, there is another insight we can derive from Kant. Kant shrewdly observes, quote, that no state at war with another shall permit such acts of hostility as would make mutual confidence impossible during a future time of peace. That is to say, no hostility should be permitted as would make mutual confidence impossible once war ends. Human dignity must be respected, even during hostilities, such that when enemies make peace, their rage at the atrocities committed in war do not result in acts of vengeance that would make coexistence impossible. Two great international lawyers from the Ukraine have made the most important contributions in this Kantian spirit in promoting human dignity even under conditions of war. I have in mind Ralph Lemkin, the originator of the Genocide Convention, and Hersch Lauterpacht, who developed the principle of crimes against humanity in international law. So in that sense, I see Lemkin and Lauterpacht as trying to develop further this Kantian principle of preserving human dignity even under conditions of use in bello. So in Lemkin's case, is the Genocide Convention that he formulated, and Lauterpacht, who participated in the Nuremberg trials, was influential in formulating the concept of crimes against humanity. There are parallel and at times conflicting stories as two born in the city of Lvov has been brilliantly told by Philip Sands in his book East-West Street. Along with Sand, I endorse the call for an international tribunal of war crimes and crimes against humanity against Russia, which forfeited its membership in the International Criminal Court on the eve of the Ukraine war. Russia took its membership back. Human dignity and humanitarian laws of war must be respected by both sides, and it's to be hoped, both for the sake of the Ukrainian people and for all of humanity, that a path to peace will be found sooner rather than later. Thank you for listening and for participating in this conference in solidarity with the academics and also in general, the people of Ukraine. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Seyla, for an excellent talk. We have a bit of time, so I'm going to follow up with a couple questions. Just to parse out for me the two, let's call them Kantian potential I don't know if you want to call them solutions to the current conflict, but you had suggested that there are potentially two ideas we can draw on from Kant that help us understand how a peace might be possible. And I think the first you mentioned was something like a Republican notion where people sovereignly or freely decide their form of government. And then the second was a notion built around sort of respect for human dignity. I wonder if you could say just a bit more about all of these specifically in the Ukraine context, and potentially the second one about human dignity. How would the notion of human dignity fit into something like a peace or working towards a peace? In particular, when, as you said, the Russians don't seem to respect this in any way. They pull out of the conventions just before the invasion. So is there a way to still appeal to these philosophical concepts when one party in particular might not respect them?
Yes, thank you, Aaron. These are really difficult questions. To begin with the second, the reckless and utter destruction of civilian targets is just absolutely baffling. And we have to point this out. I mean, if the purpose, quote unquote, of Putin's war against the Ukraine, and I'm not sure it is the Russian people's war, I don't think so. This is an authoritarian regime where the opposition cannot express itself freely. So I'm going to call it Mr. Putin's war. Mm-hmm. If the purpose of this war is somehow reincorporating Ukrainian people back, but it's also stopping Ukraine from joining the European Union, this utter devastation of cities, of concert halls, of libraries, the looting of art, the devastation of churches, of schools, of apartment buildings. What sense is this? What sense does this have? How can one expect the Ukrainian people ever to accept any kind of friendship after the war? And this seems to me to be so utterly preposterous. We just have to publicly keep saying this, and we have to keep those who are vacillating about their support for Russia, countries like South Africa or India, it's just like they have to be confronted with this, because this is not like the last stage of World War II, where this was also a crimes against humanity, where entire cities were firebombed. This is a civilian population that has not declared war against you. At the most, what they may want to do is leave your federation and sphere of influence and join, the European Union. I'm bracketing the question of NATO. Another issue.
Just quickly, if I can follow up. So is the idea here that in some ways the idea of dignity and showing the extent to which the Russians are not respecting human dignity in the way they're conducting this war is a norm we can appeal to and pressure those who are supporting Putin or at least turning a blind eye? So we put pressure on India to say that you're supporting or turning away from a regime that doesn't respect human dignity, and in some way you're implicitly also not respecting human dignity. So this Kantian norm serves as a way to show people what's really going on and what you're doing if you turn a blind eye to Russia's actions. Is this the way philosophy and the idea of dignity is working here?
Yes, I think that you're saying that's very well put. Yes, I think that in international relations, the norm of reciprocity is quite fundamental. So one has to ask, these nations who are on the fence, would you accept this to be done to your people? Are you in agreement? Right. If something like this were done to your people? Let me give you another example. This is the fate of children who are being sent from the Ukraine to Russia and who are disappearing. Whether these children are orphans or not, from what I have been reading, they are simply being transformed to quote unquote another territory and re-socialized as Russians. This actually was an article in the Genocide Convention formulated by Raphael Lemkin, that committing genocide is not just killing members of another group, but it is killing their culture, eliminating their culture by basically forbidding them from knowing their culture, speaking their language, etc. So this is another instance where human dignity indeed is absolutely violated in this war.
Thanks so much for your talk, Seyla. I really appreciate you participating in this benefit conference for the Ukrainian Academy. For all our listeners, I also really appreciate you contributing what you can to this initiative, to helping Ukrainian students, scholars, and civically engaged academics in Ukraine. We'll give everybody a few minutes to contribute to this initiative now, and we'll be back shortly. Thanks again. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.